So I'd like to welcome you again to this month's chapter meeting of the CMPS Channel Islands chapter. And tonight we are very excited to have Kristen Nelson, who is the Rare Plant Program Manager for the State Office Rare Plant Program. And she oversees and coordinates field-based projects within the Rare Plant Program, including the seed collecting program, California Plant Rescue, and the UTOM collecting project, which is the project we're going to be hearing about in October from Jordan Collins in conjunction with the LA chapter. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Management and Master's of Science in Biology from California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. And she's worked as a professional botanist and ecologist for more than 10 years across private, government, and nonprofit sectors. She's worked in diverse landscapes and habitats across the state, but her favorite places to explore are rocky serpentine slopes, where her passion and enthusiasm for conservation and exploration of California flora began. And I also should say that she has been on the board of the San Luis Obispo chapter for a bit, and you've been in charge of their programs, right, Kristen? So she knows about all of this, and now she's their rare plant chair. So before Kristen tells us about the rediscovery of the Santa Ynez Groundstar, which was on Vandenberg Space Force Base, I would like to do a land acknowledgement that's appropriate for that area. So the Chumash are the original stewards and inhabitants of what has become Vandenberg Space Force Base. And we want to pay our respects to Chumash elders of the past, present, and future who call this place their home. And so wherever you are, please pause to acknowledge the Native people whose land we're going to be talking about and to commit to support them. So Kristen, take it away.
Thanks, Ellen. You all can see my presentation as you should see it. Is that correct? And hear me okay? Good. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. It's really fun and exciting to be able to present to our neighboring chapter. As Ellen said, I've been involved in the San Luis Obispo chapter for a number of years. And I'm particularly excited to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, rare plants. And I was, as you all know, invited to talk tonight about one rare plant in particular, as well as the recent and emphasis on collaborative effort to rediscover or relocate and update what we know about what I would personally call one of our region's most elusive plants, the Santa Ynez Groundstar and Cistrocharpus keelii. So I'm going to start us off tonight with a bit of background information on data and prioritization of how we, figure out where to put our effort. And then I'm going to share some background and a little life history information about the Santa Ynez Groundstar before diving into the fun details of the actual surveys and our findings. And then I'll just bring us home with a little discussion about what this work means in a conservation context, and also what might be next for this species. So just getting us started and kind of setting the stage here, I want to provide a little context about the quote unquote behind the scenes work that informs our priorities and the work that we do in the Rare Plant Program. And when I say in the Rare Plant Program, I just want to, make the note that I'm referring both to the work that the staff from the state office does, but also the work that we do and support in collaboration with external partners and, of course, the chapter's members and volunteers. So at the risk of making what is a very plainly obvious statement, perhaps. I just wanted to start by noting that the conservation work that CNPS does is entirely driven by data. Data. One of the things that the California flora is most well known for is the high proportion of rare, threatened, and endangered species that occur here. And so the constant question with so many rare plants, of very, very few of which are pictured here, would be, how do we figure out where to put our effort, time, and money in any given year? Or in other words, how do we set priorities? And unfortunately, the answer to that is not a super clear or straightforward formula, but it does start with data. And so I'm going to attempt to begin answering this question about how we set priorities by sharing some summary metrics from the data that we do have available to us. And so just starting really high level here, some of this information is going to be stuff that you've definitely heard before, but total number of rare plants, there are nearly 2,500 minimum rank taxa that meet the definition of rare, threatened, or endangered and occur within the political boundaries of California. And that is equivalent to roughly 1/3 of our entire flora. So again, that's a statistic that likely many of you have heard before. I just want to add, though, the little caveat to this number, which is that this is the data based on what we know. And I'm just pointing that out to make the point that there's always more to discover and to learn. And so then taking it a step further and looking at these next metrics that I have listed here on the slide, a couple of these categories might be a little bit less broadly familiar to the group. So I'm going to frame these next metrics with a couple definitions just to make sure we are all on the same page. So historical is a term that we use a lot in our work, and it has a very specific meaning in this context. It refers to occurrences, or you could think of occurrences as roughly equivalent to individual populations, but it's occurrences of rare plants that have not been seen or specifically have not been documented in at least 20 years. And this is an official definition used by NatureServe. And it's an important metric that we track because, well, a lot can happen in 20 years, and especially in a state with such a large population, high development pressure, and other things added on top of just natural factors like wildfire and severe storms. So basically, if a plant does not have any documented data that, is available for us to use from the past 20 years, that would become a priority for updating in order for us to learn whether that occurrence is still extant, what its status is, are there new threats, is it declining, and just generally, are there other things we should know from a conservation standpoint? And we can't answer those questions if we don't have current data. The second metric or category that I'm going to talk about, which may or may not be familiar to you, is OKO species, which refers to taxa that are known from only one known occurrence. So that's the OKO. And again, you can think of an occurrence as being, for the purposes of this conversation, essentially equivalent to a population. So coming back to our metrics here, this next category of greater than 90% historical refers to species or taxa for which 90% or more of its known occurrences are historical, meaning they're just outdated and we don't really know what their status is. And I have some asterisks and caveats here, but that number, pulling data, as I've indicated at the top of my slide here, pulling data from the RPI, which is the CNPS Rare Plant Inventory, plus a little filtering, that number from the RPI is, I'm going to say, up to 70 individual taxa that are greater than 90% historical. And those 70 taxa, this is a ballpark, but that represents as many as roughly 700 individual occurrences that are a priority for getting updated data. And I know I've got a little acronym stuff going on here on my slide, but EOs is a technical term that we use, meaning element occurrence. And that's, you can just think of that as a population or an occurrence. So my asterisk here, the reason for this is basically is a function of the challenges of managing very large and perpetually updated data sets. And I'm going to circle back to that in just a moment. So put that in the back of your mind. And then I'm going to move on. And this next metric that I'm reporting, looking at the total number of OKO taxa in California. I didn't put an asterisk here. We do have pretty good data indicating that there are about 52 taxa in California that are known from only a single occurrence or population. And then lastly, and this last metric is going to give me an opportunity to circle back to that discussion about the challenges of data management. But lastly, combining these metrics to pull out really what would be one of the highest priority categories of plants that need updated data, ground truth field data, would be OKO taxa that are also historical. So they just have a single occurrence and nobody has documented it in at least 20 years. And so just pulling data straight from the RPI without filtering or cross-checking other databases and sort of doing that due diligence, that number seems to be 23. But for purposes of demonstrating in this discussion about data, that's a relatively manageable number. So I actually went ahead and went through those 23 taxa and did some of that additional legwork that's necessary to cross-check other databases and to filter through backlogs and basically true that number up a little bit. And I determined that it's likely closer to 5 is the total number of taxa for OKO species that are also historical. And so this brings me back to my side note that I want to make about data and the challenges of managing large data sets and the concept of, air quotes here, rediscovery. First, it's important to remember that our data output, or in other words, for example, the metrics I've just reported out, our data output is only as robust and accurate as the data input. And so thinking about that another way, our analyses and our prioritization efforts can only be as current and accurate as the data that we actually have available to us. And while it may seem like a relatively straightforward thing to intake and manage accurate data, it is in fact a pretty challenging, expensive, sometimes tedious, and constant effort. And so thinking specifically about rare plant data in California, this challenge is further complicated by the fact that there are numerous popular and common sources of data input. So basically entry points that all of our experts and botanists and enthusiasts across the whole geographic range of California, they're all choosing their favorite database to input their data. And that's wonderful. And they're all great sources. I have them or some of the top ones listed here on my slide: the CNDDB, the Consortium of California Herbaria, iNaturalist, CalFlora, CalPhotos. And these are all databases. They're all managed by completely independent entities. And although many of these entities collaborate and share data, you can't get around the fact that the format and the quality and the level of vetting and even just the data that is requested, like the number of fields that are requested for each of these unique and independent databases, is variable. So getting all that data into the same format and vetting and quality checking it and then getting it into a single place is a continuous and significant effort. And so that's why on my previous slides with the metrics that I reported, I noted that the data was pulled from the RPI, but also with some filtering. And basically what that means is this process where folks on our team, everyone contributes, but the numbers that I reported, I think were most recently vetted by Erin and Caitlin on our team. They've gone through the raw exported data and then done all of this extra filtering based on information that's in the backlog, based on outreach to experts, based on cross-checking all of these other databases, and so on and so forth. So enough on that. But the second and related point that I wanted to make quickly is when we are making quote unquote rediscoveries or going back to these really outdated occurrences and sort of relocating populations, it's just worth acknowledging that maybe in fact someone has seen that species or that specific population more recently than we know about. And it's just not reported, or we just don't have access to that information. And so all that said, we do the best we can with the data that we have. So taking all that, just circling back to this question of setting priorities and taking into account everything that I have just discussed, how do we identify priority targets and decide where to spend our effort? So I've got a list here that is not necessarily entirely exhaustive, and it's not necessarily ranked in any order of priority or importance. But these are some key considerations, and I think it's just worth keeping in mind. Again, like I said earlier, this isn't a super clear or straightforward equation for figuring out priorities, but things like funding opportunities and what the priorities of our funders are is a factor sometimes. That might either dictate or narrow down where we're placing our effort. Of course, if there are development threats, new or maybe expected on the horizon, that might place some prioritization on specific rare taxa or just regions that have rare taxa. Of course, we've just talked about OKO and historical species, and the reasons why they would be a priority. If a species has an imminent threat of extinction or is suspected to possibly already be extinct, that can be a reason for prioritizing it. And that might not be super intuitive. Like if it's already extinct, then maybe we should put our effort elsewhere. But it is really important to document extinctions or local extinctions, because that can really inform future conservation actions. Of course, if there's taxonomic challenges with a challenging group of related species or just one species in particular, it can be really important and helpful to get updated data and possibly, vouchers and physical tissue to work with to help us unravel those taxonomic challenges. And then there's, of course, other unique considerations like really disjunct populations or populations that occur at really disjunct range limits, and practical considerations like access, proximity, and time. So there's a lot that goes into it. And thinking about the San Ynez Groundstar, this is a taxon that until this year was 100% historical, because we had, or was considered 100% historical because we had no current data reported anywhere on any of the occurrences of this species. And if you saw any of the press about this work and these surveys, like the LA Times article, you'll note that the way that was reported out was as though this was an OKO species. And I'm going to just sort of touch on that in this discussion tonight, because technically we do have two separate, like looking back, we have two separate vouchered records of the species, which would be counted as two occurrences. But realistically, looking through the technical piece of it, I tend to think of this species as an OKO. And it's fine if you disagree with that, but basically that put it in that ranking of among the very short list of priority taxa in my mind of both OKO, extremely narrow range, and 100% historical. So you can pick which bullet would be more appropriate if you disagree with me at the end of this, but I'll just add for a personal touch too, that some of the personal influences for me prioritizing updates for this species included that not only is it just geographically sort of close to where I live and botanize the most, but I also have tried unsuccessfully to unravel the mystery of where and how to find this species for several years. So the opportunities that this significant rain year presented made me feel like it would be a good year to try and find it. So I want to share a little history about this species and its past, documented occurrences, and a little life history. So within the sunflower family, it is a member of the Nephalee tribe, which includes all those woolly-headed, tiny flowered things that can be really challenging to key and ID, like pseudonephaliums and Psilocarpus and Hesperivax and so on. The first record that I know of that we have of this species was a voucher collection made by Ralph Hoffman in 1929. And from that collection, we have some really ambiguous location information and a little bit of habitat information, but all pretty vague. And then the next record that we have of this species came 66 years later from a voucher collected by Dave Keel at Vandenberg Space Force Base. And Dave on his voucher label information did provide a little bit more, like a little bit of a narrower, it wasn't just reported as occurring at Vandenberg. He did provide some relatively helpful, a little bit narrower information describing the location where he found it. And also just a note that at the time of both of these collections, these plants were identified as Hesperivax acaulis, because it had not yet been identified as a novel species. And that wasn't until 2004, using Dave Keel's 1995 vouchers, that James Moorfield determined that it was a new species and published the name Ancestrocarpus keelii, with Dave's specimens designated as the type specimens. So just to put a timeline on that full story, from the time of the first collection to the time it was described as a new species, that was a gap of 75 years. And if you work in herbaria at all, that time span probably doesn't surprise you. And then it was also nearly 10 years from the time that type specimen was collected until it was described. And now in 2023, it's been nearly 100 years since the first collection, and nearly 30 years since that most recent documentation, that most recent voucher. And this, or as of earlier this year, this remained all of the information that we knew about this species. We had a general location, a decent habitat description, absolutely no photographs of it in situ or even in living condition, nor any certainty about the status of its continued population and just its general status. So with that context, you can understand why this species, whether or not it is truly an OKO or not, but it rose to the top for priority targets to get updated field data. So I'm going to transition now and share a little bit about the legwork and research that I specifically went through that led up to the actual field work in collaboration with Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. But to just note that there's like a whole other set of folks working on this, and we were sort of working toward each other and doing some legwork before crossing paths. So if we take a look at the profile page in the CNPS rare plant inventory for this species, there are a couple notable things, and some of this is a recap of what I just summarized, but I just want to point it out on the profile page. First, you can look at the total number of occurrences on the right-hand side here and see that it does actually call out 2 occurrences, which reflects that 1929 and the 1995 vouchers. And then down below it, it indicates how many of the total occurrences are historical. So again, as of early this year, both of them were historical. But then if we take a look at the notes section more toward the left side here, this summarizes, again, what we've just talked about, which is that the locality information for that very old voucher has extremely ambiguous location information. And so in no way am I discounting the importance and the validity of that 1929 occurrence. It's just that we have no real tangible or useful locality information that we can use to hunt things down. And no way to really get more, no amount of research was going to get us more detailed locality information. So I also just wanted to point out here that there's no threat information reported, which is really just indicative of how little information we have or had about this taxon. And there are, or at least were, as I've already noted, absolutely no photos of it in fresh or living condition. And so these photos of the voucher, of the pressed vouchers, 10 years post-collection were all that we had to go off of. So, of course, the next step is to just start down the research rabbit hole and start checking all of the data sources and databases. And I wanted to actually insert a little side note here because I thought this was really interesting. This slide here was actually taken directly from Aaron Sims' presentation that he gave at the CNPS conference last fall, so almost a year ago. And just for timeline context, that was actually before I was even hired on staff with CNPS. And here in this slide, he was talking also about OKO and historical and priority target species. And he had pulled out these 4 plants as examples that have of plants that have a single, specifically a single recent occurrence. And that was in a discussion about how to understand the pros and cons, as well as the potential for misinterpretation of the data as it is presented in various databases. And I just thought it was so interesting that Encystrocarpus keelii was one of these example plants. And in this case, what he was looking at and pointing out in his presentation was this 2005 record reported in the CalFlora database for this species. And again, looking at this as this like single sort of recent occurrence that's an outlier from all the rest of the data that we have about a taxon. And the point here was to look at that record with some skepticism and to realize that one facet of the CalFlora database is that it often includes checklist points, which you may all be well aware of. And those are wonderful data points, but they also, if you're looking at a map, they sort of falsely appear as though they're truly geo-referenced observation points for any species that's listed on that checklist. And for this record, that was exactly the case. So looking at the CalFlora page for this and the details, it is clearly reported as a checklist. And it's just important to note that oftentimes when folks upload checklists, they'll include species not only that they personally directly observed themselves, but they will also do their own research and add things to a checklist that are just from other reports that they find in their own research through other databases, maybe even personal communications. And again, that's all wonderful and valid data, but it's just worth noting that the person that's uploading the checklist is not necessarily a direct observer of all of the things on that checklist. So this particular checklist was for the La Purísima mission, and the source of information for this species in this location is cited as a personal website, which if you go there today is no longer a valid URL. And so again, I'm chasing down the rabbit hole, and this was kind of the start of, well, in the thick of the research, I suppose. And so I just wanted to summarize really quick the data points that up to this point in my effort to figure out where to find the St. Ynez Groundstar or where best to find it. I just want to summarize the data points that I had compiled so far, which is, of course, the 2 voucher specimens, one with very ambiguous location information. And then there's this really outlier point at the mission. And so, of course, I reached out to the person who uploaded that checklist. He was very helpful and accommodating, very quick to respond, Elihu Gervitz, who told me the following. This is paraphrased, but shared with me a confirmation that he and his co-surveyors, in fact, did not directly observe that species, and that they had included information from these other folks that had come before them, Wayne Farron and Larry Ballard, as well as a little bit of habitat information. And so, although he didn't have any information for me that was going to help on this quest, he was able to connect me with someone else who connected me with Wayne Farron. And I went back and forth with Wayne a little bit, and we sort of talked about why this came up and the interest in relocating the species, and sort of went down a little side rabbit hole. But in the end, we came to the following conclusions. And again, Wayne was also wonderful and very helpful and accommodating. He checked the original 1984 report from work that he had done at and near the mission and confirmed there was no reference to any Hesperivax species. And again, that is what it would have been called at the time. It would have been labeled under Hesperivax. He checked the Consortium of California Herbaria and found no specimens, and then came to sort of the final conclusion and shared with me that it seems that we don't know from whom this observation was made. I'll just note too that I did my own research in the Consortium of California Herbaria and found no references to Hesperivax or Evax or any potential synonyms for this species, nor any records associated with Wayne or Larry. So that was a very unsatisfying dead end. And I'm not going to detail all of the research and correspondence. Hopefully this is at least just interesting in what this rabbit hole can entail. But at this point, of course, the only logical occurrence to focus on was the one at Vandenberg. And so hopefully it goes without saying that, yes, of course, I reached out to Dave Keel, who I do have a personal relationship with. He had no additional details he could recall beyond what was on the voucher label. And of course, I reached out to James Moorfield, who described the species, but had never seen it in situ himself. So he had no additional info he could offer in terms of locality, but he was able to let me know that Matt Williams and the wonderful folks at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden had also contacted him recently and were on the hunt for relocating this species as well. And so a search party was born. And I want to just take a moment at this point to say that they had been down their own rabbit hole of research for some time as well, and were very welcoming to me just in joining forces and teaming up to basically go together or attempt to go together to find this occurrence at Vandenberg. So the folks that ended up going in the field together on our survey day were Matt Williams, Kevin Mason, and Sean Carson from Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, as well as Sarah DeGroot, who works as a botanist at Vandenberg, and myself. And it was a wonderful group of people to be able to do some botanical field work with. So again, I've sort of alluded to this earlier, but I just want to make the side note that this whole story is like my version of the story, and they had their own path. And I wanted to give a little foreshadowing that you'll have the opportunity to read about the efforts for these surveys and for this conservation work from the perspective of the garden staff in the upcoming edition of the CMPS publication Flora that will be coming out later this fall. So keep your eyes out for that. And so now a new person is going to enter the discussion that I haven't mentioned yet. And I actually saw that he's here tonight, so I have to nail this, and I can't misrepresent the facts here. Not that I would want to, but we go in the field, and with the help of detailed notes given to the garden team from Dieter Wilken about where we could find the population with a pretty high level of accuracy on the landscape, definitely a higher level of accuracy than what we just had from Dave's label information. We did indeed relocate the type locality. And I don't have details about this effort, but I just wanted to note, I didn't learn this until later, that Dieter had actually, the reason he had some information to share with the garden team is because he had visited the population in 2011. And that flew right under the radar. So just to like harken back to what I mentioned earlier, you know, these rediscovery concepts are really just based on the data that we have available to us. But he did give extremely helpful location information to the team that helped us find it with relative ease once we had boots on the ground. And just a couple high level like summary notes here from what we found. I know that it's very unsatisfying to say a few thousand plants, but the population was partially very, very fresh and in beautiful condition, and partially very, very senesced and crispy at the time that we were out there in mid-April. And so quite a range of phenology, all within a very short distance of each other, making it pretty challenging to estimate. But I think we came up with between 2,000 and 3,000 plants total, at very most covering a maximum polygon of up to a quarter acre. And then important to note that within that, the plants were not like a dense carpet. It was mostly just kind of scattered individuals, which hopefully is at least somewhat apparent through the photos that I'm sharing. So taking a little closer look, just to share some details about habitat. We found the plants growing along the edges and in the openings of short-statured maritime chaparral. In my lower left photo here, if you lean in, you can note that's Matt Williams standing out in the middle of the chaparral shrub habitat. So, you know, very short-statured, sort of classic maritime wind-pruned shrubs. And then the microsites consisted of mostly a sandy substrate. It doesn't really look sandy in the pictures, but the whole area is just kind of stabilized by this biotic crust that includes everything from liverworts, mosses, lichens, and of course, lots of other dinophytes, just other very tiny vascular plants. So the dominant components of the chaparral habitat, the associates in the shrub layer, were by far and away chamise and La Purissima manzanita, which is of course also a listed species. There were just low cover scattered individuals of sagebrush, coffeeberry, poison oak, and some other things as well. But definitely chamise and the manzanita were dominant. Other associates in the understory and in the herbaceous layer, rush rose was notable. There were, of course, phyllories, both Erodium secutarium and botryes, lots of crassula, mosses, lichens, liverworts, and notably several other species than the Phalii tribe. So there were Psilocarpus and Micropus and Logpia and lots of other little close relatives to the Ensistrocharpus Hesperivax group. And then I noted here too a sanicle that was pretty common, which I'm going to tentatively call Sanicula arguta. It did look a little weird. And I even looked up Matt's voucher from that day to see what he put, and he left it as a SPA. So if you feel like putting a name on that for me, feel free to chime in at the end. Okay, so importantly, other than having a great time and experiencing that thrill of seeing a very rare plant for the first time, what did we accomplish? Well, data. To just stick to my theme here, this occurrence is no longer historical. We've updated information, what we know about it, threats, population size, status, habitat, location. Also importantly, the Vandenberg Space Force botanists, not just Sarah, but also her colleagues at the base have gone out and seen it since that day. So they have a search image. And of course, one of the first steps in protecting or conserving something is just knowing it. So that is actually a really important step. We also have new and modern vouchers, which is important. The garden team, also the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, did conservation seed banking for this species, which is hugely important for, the long-term protection of this species, especially with so few occurrences. Photos, right? You can't, like I just said, you can't conserve it or protect it if you don't know it. So now there are photos that you can find in iNaturalist and Cal Flora and Cal Photos. So we can actually see what it looks like in context, in its habitat, and in fresh condition. And then the last thing I wanted to note here, because this is really important, is that on 3 separate efforts this past spring, all together on that same day that we relocated the type locality, and then independently myself and the garden team separately went back and did do additional searching to look for more occurrences in similar nearby habitat on Vandenberg, and did not find it anywhere else that we looked, even in very like carbon copy similar looking habitat, like a stone's throw away. So though a little disappointing, that's still really important data, right? That's confirmed negative observations basically, and that's important data too, so to know where it doesn't occur, or at least this year where it doesn't occur. So the next thing, is to ask, well, what's next for this species? And I'm gonna pose this next question sort of rhetorically, with a big caveat. This is sort of for fun, but with a big caveat that I do not personally have the expertise within this very challenging group of asters to make any data supported claims on this front. But I did chat with Matt, who I think does have expertise in this realm, while we were in the field, and it really just struck me upon seeing Ensistrocharpus keelii how much it reminded me of Hesperivax caulescens. And as a reminder, it was originally identified as Hesperivax acaulis. And then also, so not only it struck me how much it looks like Hesperivax caulescens, but relatively speaking, how little it looks like the only other California member of the genus Ensistrocharpus. So again, my big caveat is that I have no data supported claims to make here, but I thought it would be fun to put this smattering of photos of close relatives up and maybe just pose this sort of rhetorical question. And so I'm going to put labels on all of these photos and then make one more point, which is just that this rhetorical question helps to point out that now that we do have updated and ample fresh genetic material available through those new vouchers, at least addressing questions like this, if warranted, is possible, right? The folks with the skills and the facilities necessary to address any taxonomic questions could do so much more easily now that we have new vouchers. So that's it's just an important conservation piece to point out. And then maybe perhaps more importantly, or at least more relevantly, the other questions that come to my mind basically come down to where else might we want to look for other populations of this species? Specifically, does it still occur somewhere generally along the San Ynez River basin between Lompoc and Buellton, which is the broad geographic area where Hoffman's collection was reported from? Also, does it occur at La Purísima Mission? Was that a typo or an error, or is that a real reference that I just can't find or that got lost, right? And so I'm personally very curious. It seems at least feasible that it could be at the mission somewhere, based on, location and broad habitat. Doesn't seem out of the question. And then more broadly, where else could we look? Where in this whole region could we narrow down the habitat requirements and so on and so forth, and put out some meaningful effort? So the last thing I want to say to the Channel Islands chapter, I assume there's at least a little interest out there, is if you find yourself looking and surveying for it, negative data is important too. And please do go look for it. And if you do, just be sure to report on both positive and negative data. And of course, if you have positive data, there's going to be a lot of people very interested in that. So anyway, I hope this was interesting, and I will leave it there, and hopefully we have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Kristen. You actually already have a question in the chat from Andrea, who is curious about the population size, which you now have more data on, because she thought it looked like the type specimen had quite a few plants on it.
Yeah, great question. So again, our estimate of the population is in the 2,000 to 3,000 range, and I fully acknowledge that's kind of a broad range. We usually try to do a little bit more of an accurate estimate. It was just a tricky thing to enumerate based on phenology that we were observing. And Keel's specimen, so keep in mind context. When Keel was collecting the species, what he was doing was just a vouchered flora. He was doing I want to just document everything. And I don't know if anybody's been in the field with one of these botanists, these old school botanists that just run around and voucher everything. They're so efficient. I don't know how they collect so much data in such a small amount of time, but that's what he was doing. He was like, here's something, throw it in the press. And so I don't know that he even bothered to enumerate the population at that time. And because it's tiny plants, you do want to try to fill the herbarium sheet. So doesn't surprise me at all that he collected maybe 10 or 12 plants just to put on a single sheet and probably duplicated it, which seems huge, but at the time it was just kind of like Hespery vaxacalis, common, whatever, we're collecting everything and move on. So the context is important to note there. All of that to say, it could have been several thousand plants, and he, collected a couple dozen of them. Maybe it was less than that, and it was just not known at that time what a globally rare species it was. So all that to say, his 24 plants or whatever individual plants that he collected, I don't think is inappropriate, but yeah.
Before we move on, there's a couple more questions, but before we move on, can you just provide some guidelines if people were to, find a rare plant? What is the guideline for collecting a few plants from a population? Like how many, what's the percentage?
Yeah. So CMPS has some great published guidelines, but a couple of things that I would just note, right off the top, is don't ever collect the first 1 or even 10 plants that you find, especially with a very small annual kind of thing like this. Shrubs obviously are a little different, but if you start seeing something, and especially if you think it's a rare plant, first document the whole entirety of the area, right? And if you come up with, maybe you're on a road edge or next to the San Ynez River drainage or something, and you just find 10 or 20 plants, I would probably first document it with photos and maybe get some additional folks out there and like just make sure you document the whole area well. I mean, I think ultimately we would want to voucher that, but if you go out and you have a new positive confirmation of a new population, we would probably want to voucher that. But if it is a very small population, that we would want to be very diligent about. I think 10% is the max. And so again, if you are only dealing with 20 or 30 or even 50 plants, that's going to be a pretty small number.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Did you want to look at the questions in the chat, or did you
Yeah.
want? Okay.
I have it open here. So we addressed Andrea's question. Betsy, as an amateur, what's the best way to report negative data? So currently the best way that we request data submissions is actually directly to the CNDB. Admittedly, that system is a little clunky, but they do allow for negative reporting in that system. It's an online system, but there's also paper forms. And maybe we can type that in the chat because it's a little acronym-y, but the CNDB is the California Natural Diversity Database, which is the statewide natural heritage database managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so their reporting system allows for negative observations. And then I would also just say that if it's confusing or you just want some links and a little bit of guidance, by all means, reach out to our team, to me or Erin or Ellen. We can maybe get you squared away.
I can't seem to type that into the chat. I don't know why.
There.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just an acronym, but that'll be a starting place, and then reach out if you want a little more guidance or details. Okay, so hang on, my scroll or my chat scrolled. What are the most distinctive identification features of this species? Well, its size. In this photo that I've got on the screen here, I know it's partially faded out, but down at the base of those spoon-shaped leaves, those are flowers. And so just from a standpoint of how the structure of those flowers are, I mean, again, I'm not reporting myself as an expert in the Nephalii tribe, but those flowers, the little cluster at the base of the spoon-shaped, hairy spoon-shaped leaves. And if you can tell in this photo, maybe if you lean in, there are teeny tiny little spine tips at the tip of each leaf. And then I would just say that again, if you think you find a positive, new occurrence with this species, please let some folks know. Matt Williams at the garden would be great for local, let us know. People are going to want to know, and we can get some experts to help confirm the ID that it's not a Hesperivax or a something else. That's my best answer because I'm not an expert on this group. Okay, did it seem like the plant was spreading north toward the Space Force area of Vandenberg, or are there natural boundaries that would keep the plant confined to certain areas like valleys? Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So I don't think it was spreading anywhere. I'll just say that I think that we relocated the type locality in the same place where the type locality was originally documented by Dave Keel in 1995. Because of its stature, we are hypothesizing about this together while we were in the field a little bit. It seems like seed dispersal is likely not a very successful, wide-reaching thing. Even potential critters that might spread seed, that feels like a challenging thing for this taxon. I don't think it's just making a big jump 200 meters away or 500 meters away or miles away. It did seem, as we were driving around looking and hiking around looking for other spots outside that type locality where we could do additional surveys and try to look for it elsewhere, it did seem like the natural topographic features in that area were basically there's this sort of mesa type habitat, mesa type topography with the chaparral habitat. And then very quickly you kind of get off that mesa and the topography drops down into drainages and valleys, and the habitat and the structure and the stature of the habitat changes quite a bit. So within Vandenberg, based on what we observed and where we had access, it seemed relatively bounded by the topography. Yeah, that was a good question.
The reason I'm asking, can you hear me, is
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, because the Vandenberg Space Force Base is really increasing the number of space launches in various areas around there, if in fact it's going to be impacting any of the species, and, you know, is there any way to really tell that? I'm sure if they clear away things, they're just basically scraping stuff up and, you know, putting it in
Yeah.
a pile. So, is there
Agreed.
any way that, I mean, you can make their biologists aware of the fact that this might be, should be on their radar as something that should be looked for before they in fact designate areas to be used for the launches?
Yeah, great question, Nancy. So I'll just share what I know and what I can share. One, the base botanists now know about it, and it's very much on their radar, and they have been hand in hand with us with like all of the publicity and the press release and everything else. Like, it wasn't just like, okay, we saw a plant and we moved on with our lives and forgot about it. They've been pretty interested and involved in all of the conversations about it. And part of that has to do with sensitivity around sharing location information as it relates to Vandenberg infrastructure, but they're also like very interested in just being aware of this species. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I understand it, the launch facilities are pretty, relatively speaking, within, you know, the boundaries of Vandenberg, pretty far from where this type locality is. And I've looked at it on a map, and I've actually seen the proposals for the increased launch facilities. And so I can't speak to whether or not it ever did occur near their infrastructure. We did not have permission to access that portion of the facilities. But what I can say again is that it seems like where it does occur, it's this topographic sort of mesa, and then the topography on the base changes and drops down. So it's a little bit of a asterisk and a caveat answer there. I can't possibly know what is down by the launch facilities, but my assumption would be that they have to have people looking and do all the normal environmental review and surveys. And having the base botanists know what's going on is a huge, like, that was a huge conservation, like, checkbox.
Well, that's great. If you have an you know, an access to them and you're talking to them. The other thing that you should know is that because of the increased launches planned, and there is another group that's coming in called Phantom X that is planning on having 48 launches currently, and that is currently being discussed with the Coastal Commission staff, which apparently is they are trying to find an agreement on ESHA. And so if you have any information or any thoughts about ESHA in terms of the native plants, it would be good to contact the Coastal Commission staff that's working on that and let them know your concerns, because my understanding as of a couple of months ago is that they were having a hard time coming to agreement on what would be ESHA, and I don't know if that's the Phantom X people or the Vandenberg people or whatever, because obviously, I guess Vandenberg gets money to have these launches, and so they want to do them, but they also want to do them within an environmentally sound area so that they don't cause any problems. So if
Right.
you know, tell your people to reach out to the Coastal Commission, because it still has not yet come on the agenda again. It was postponed, with any information that might be helpful for the plants in that area. So thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks for that. I'm grinning just because in my consulting days, I'm remembering how complicated ESHA is, which for folks that don't know is just a jargony acronym that stands for environmentally sensitive habitat area, which sounds very generic, but is in fact very specific to sensitive habitats within the coastal zone and get their own special designation, and it's complicated. So yeah, anyway, thanks for that, Nancy.
So I thought we'd just take one last question. It looks like Andrea has another one in the chat about the habitat and the stabilized ancient sand dunes.
Yeah, my answer is yes, I think it is. I've only been to the mission once and it was quite a long time ago, but I think it's feasible to entertain that it could actually occur there. I just don't know where that original source information came from. So yeah, I attempted through this presentation, but also posted in the locations that I listed, Ynez, CalFlora and CalPhotos, to include some photos that sort of show that soil context, because I think that's a really important component of its microsite habitat. So being able to not just see the plant, which is very cute next to a penny, but like sort of what's going on a little bit around it to understand that microsite. And that would be something to look for if that's occurring with the chaparral, that ancient chaparral sand dune habitat. Thank you for that link in the chat, Leslie. For anybody interested in a link directly to the CNDDB data submittals, it's in the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leslie, for putting that in there. So I just wanted to thank Kristen. If you guys want to turn off your mute and give her a round of applause. I really appreciate her taking the time to do this.
Very, very interesting
Thank
and
you.
detailed. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks so much for taking the time in the evening to talk with us. I really appreciate it. All right, so our next chapter meeting, as we announced at the beginning, is going to be the second Tuesday of the month in October, and Jordan Collins will be talking to us about the botanical resources of the Utah watershed. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending and coming to this meeting.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks for being
you.
here.
Thanks, Kristen.
Yeah, good to see you, Annie.
Good to see you too.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Yeah, have a great night, everybody.